Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar, gathering more than 400 participants from all regions of the globe. Well, today we have our second part of a webinar series dedicated to IoT regulation. But before we get started, you have here a screenshot of the platform we will be using today. So you can ask your questions in the question tab, which is marked with the arrow A. And so you can ask your question during the whole webinar. We will take them at the end during the Q&A session. And if we cannot take your question, we'll try to answer you by email after this webinar. You can also find the slides and some documentation in the documentation tab. So that's the small arrow B. So don't hesitate to download the slides, but we will also send them by email tomorrow. So today's webinar is being recorded. You will also have access to the recording tomorrow. So after the webinar, we will also you will also see a small survey and to give us feedback. So we will really appreciate if you could send us your feedback. This is very important for us to improve for future events, but also because we will be planting a tree for each feedback we received. So 400 participants, we hope to plant 400 trees by the end of the webinar. Okay, so finally, I just have to introduce today's speakers. First, my colleague Veronika Bokarova, who is responsible for Cullen International's regulatory training portfolio. She also works for our brand new IoT service, and she has more than 20 years of professional experience. And we also have with us Donald from Transatel. So Donald is the head of policy and regulatory affairs at Transatel company, and his career spans over a quarter century, during which he has become a leading authority on ICT regulation, policy and compliance. We also have Robert, who is from Comreg and also co-chair of BEREC. Robert joined Comreg as a commissioner in 2019 and is currently serving his second 5-year term. And he also worked for Cubic Telecom and Vodafone Group in the past. And finally, last but not least, we have Luciana with us from Telenor IoT. So Luciana has more than 15 years experience in technology, regulation, and commercial and business strategy. She's a seasoned leader in the Internet of Things sector, and she's specialized in driving complex cross-functional initiatives that align regulatory compliance with technological innovation and commercial success. So thank you for being with us today. And with no further ado, I will pass the floor to my colleague, Veronika.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So, Internet of Things, continuing the series of our webinars dedicated to the regulatory aspects in the Internet of Things connectivity. Sarah, next slide, please. We acknowledge that we are joined today by a very wide audience, and maybe not all of you are familiar with Cullen International. So just a very quick word of introduction about Cullen. For 35 years, we've been tracking, reporting, and benchmarking developments in regulation of telecommunications, video, digital economy, and postal regulation across Europe and beyond. Our service portfolio now also includes competition law intelligence, consumer protection regulations, sustainability, and finally, last but not least, our recently launched IoT regulatory intelligence also looks into policies and regulations across the world that affect cross-border IoT connectivity. So this is actually how the idea to organize this webinar series was born, based on our recent research results for our newly launched IoT service. We looked at across a number of regulatory issues facing global IoT connectivity providers across 65 countries in 5 regions: Americas, Africa, Europe, Middle East, and Asia Pacific. And so we decided that why not to bring up to bring out some of our findings for the discussion. And so next slide, Sarah, please. And just to say on the scope of our research, we focus specifically on the IoT connectivity. And as I believe many of the colleagues joining us today, you know that connectivity for IoT services could be provided over extremely wide range of networks. Could be public and private mobile networks using cellular technologies, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. Could be also delivered over fixed networks such as narrowband IoT services, over private mobile networks using unlicensed frequencies such as LoRa or Sigfox, shorter range wireless protocols, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and finally also satellite 5G technologies. So all those technologies, they ultimately contribute to IoT connectivity. However, for our research, we've specifically chosen to focus on cellular IoT connections because they represent about 22% today of global IoT connections. And they were amounting around 4 billion connected SIM cards at the end of last year. And this share is expected to grow further. And this also the segment which happens to be mostly regulated in the context of, for example, public mobile networks. So that has been the focus of our research, and those are also the aspects we would like to discuss today. And of course, an important aspect for our research was also the fact that many of IoT connectivity services, they are cross-border by their very nature. So they have very global focus to begin with, because many of the connected devices, they're being assembled in one country, then they're being fitted with SIM cards in another country, and then they could be supplied anywhere across the globe. So certainly the cross-border aspect is very important. And for this second webinar, just like our first one, we still would like to focus on the EU regulatory landscape. Sarah, next slide, please. So, at the risk of disappointing some of the colleagues in our audience, for today we're still going to talk Europe, just like during our first series, our very first webinar last month in April, with the representatives of Vodafone and European Commission. We've been discussing the European landscape. We continue that today as well. But stay with us for the next webinar, which will be announced very shortly, the exact timing, where we would definitely shift into more global focus. Perhaps just a quick explanation why such a strong focus on Europe. Well, we wanted to take an opportunity of forthcoming review of the EU regulatory framework and just look at the challenges which are specifically confronting the pan-European IoT connectivity providers in this context. And so also the review, just also for our non-EU participants, we should expect sometime later this year the review of the European Electronic Communications Code, the review of the EU roaming regulation, and then finally, a completely new piece of regulation, the Digital Networks Act. So all that leaves us up for a debate. What could be improved in the existing regulatory framework to make it more suitable for providers such as our today's participants, Telenor and Transatel, who have to confront all those regulatory challenges on day-to-day basis. And since we also have the pleasure of having Robert representing BEREC today, I also have to mention that some of the key insights for our today's discussion have been also drawn from BEREC recent deliverables covering, among others, opinion on the implementation and functioning of general authorization regime in the European Union, BEREC report on machine-to-machine connectivity and permanent roaming, BEREC opinion on market and technological developments affecting end-user rights, and finally also BEREC input on the review of the EU roaming regulation. Next slide, please. And so key discussion topics will be centered around the following issues: the authorization framework, general authorization regime as such for IoT connectivity providers, and also notification and reporting requirements across individual EU member states, numbering resources they have been assigned to IoT that have been envisaged for pan-European IoT connectivity services, and as well as ITU global numbering ranges that also been used by many providers for that purpose. Permanent roaming, which is the most common tool to achieve global connectivity, and we'll discuss briefly about end user protection measures in that context, which apply to all providers, including IoT connectivity providers, and also a little bit expand a little bit also on wholesale roaming access arrangements, which are largely remain subject to commercial negotiations. And finally, we also look into provider switching requirements under various pieces of the European regulations. Next slide, Sarah, please. Just perhaps also, again, acknowledging the fact that we have non-EU audience, some representatives from non-EU in the audience, just a few highlights from our research and the mentioned BEREC deliverables. Next slide. First of all, unlike we see in some countries beyond Europe, under the EU regulatory framework, although IoT takes quite a significant place across many sector policies, we do not find general definition of IoT services as such in the European Electronic Communications framework, in the European Electronic Communications Code. The code, however, defines machine-to-machine services, which could be seen as a subset of broader IoT concept. But the immediate implication is that in many countries, the national regulators might interpret the scope of the specific services in a different way, which also implies different implementation, different interpretation of authorization requirements. Next. So just to illustrate the landscape that colleagues such as Luciana and Donald are facing on daily basis when they have to deal with authorization and notification requirements across EU. As you can see, despite the fact that the recital of 41 of European Electronic Communications Code generally calls for the least onerous authorization system possible to stimulate the development of pan-European electronic communications networks and services, we could question whether they're exactly there, because as you can see, interpretations are quite different. We have three countries, namely 2 EU member states, France and Denmark, plus we also have the UK, which do not apply any sort of notification requirements to ACN SES providers. But then we have different interpretations by the remaining EU member states and European countries. So in some countries we have general authorization with notification applying to any type of services, or we might have general authorization with notification applying depending on the underlying contractual relationship. In other words, only if you have contracts direct contracts with the end users or business users in specific country, you would be subject to general authorization with notification regime, or it could be even more obscure. It would be even less defined than that. Basically, the regulators would be saying, depending on the underlying business model, we would decide on case-by-case basis what kind of authorization regime applies, if any. So that's in brief. Next slide. On numbering resources, just as a reminder, Article 93 of the Code requires member states to make available a range of non-geographic numbers for extraterritorial use to provide electronic services other than interpersonal communication services across the EU. Again, from what we've seen across EU member states, the interpretation of these provisions could be sometimes quite divergent, because we have countries that interpret that concept of services other than interpersonal in a way, for example, just limiting it strictly to machine-to-machine communications, explicitly excluding provision of internet access services or other type of services. And then also, as I already mentioned, many of the global providers, in addition to non-geographical numbers for extraterritorial use, they might also rely on ITU assigned numbers, so ITU global numbers. But from there, we understand that global providers, they sometimes facing very practical difficulties in reaching commercial roaming agreements and also routing traffic from global ITU numbers, which sometimes being blocked by national operators. Next slide, Sarah, please. On permanent roaming, I mentioned the reason why we're bringing this up. It's because we're approaching the discussion on the review of the EU roaming regulation. And so EU roaming regulation treats machine-to-machine IoT connectivity in quite interesting way, because on one hand, it tells us explicitly that machine-to-machine communications are not excluded from the scope of the roaming regulation, which ultimately means that normally they could be provided subject to normal end user protection measures and fair usage provisions. But on the other hand, Article 3 of roaming regulation also says that permanent roaming, which, as we know, is one of the key modalities for delivering cross-border connectivity for IoT services, basically is entirely left to commercial roaming negotiations. But operators are allowed to apply restrictions to permanent roaming agreements. So again, it's something that the aspect we intend to discuss further today. And Sarah, last slide, please. On provider switching, also just as a reminder, number portability requirements under the EU regulatory framework, they apply also to IoT connectivity services as long as they're using numbers from the national numbering plans, although those numbers as such might not present any intrinsic value to the end users. And the European Electronic Communications Code also invites member states to promote over-the-air provisioning as an important mechanism to facilitate provider switching for M2M services. However, from what we've seen in practice across many countries, well, maybe there are some very specific country examples when we've noted there are practical challenges in applying internet access provider switching when, for example, in quite restricting provisions on duration on contract in combination to provider switching are applied, for example, to connected vehicles, to connected cars. And sometimes it's not easy to achieve in practice. Next slide, please. Yes, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. So with that, I would pass it over to you, Luciana.
Thank you. And thank you, Veronica, for this introduction. It will be a very interesting discussion I'm looking forward to. Maybe Sarah, if we could put on my slides, please. And thank you so much for the invitation for today. Okay, so Telenor IoT, who are we? Next slide, please. So Telenor IoT, it's a business division in the Telenor Group. We are specialized in IoT. Actually, we pioneer. We started operating as a separate entity already in 2008. We are considered as a leader in the leader quadrant of Gartner, and we provide services worldwide. Today, so we have more than 20 years experience. Today we have like around 25 million SIM cards connected, and we have had stable growth along the years. We have two main products, one called IoT Connect, which is basically providing managed connectivity, here important via permanent roaming. So hence why permanent roaming is quite important for us, although we also have localized solutions. We're providing services to really large multinational, which really needs to connect their product around the world via IoT Connect. And then we have another product, which is called IoT Complete, which is a bit larger, including devices and more services than purely managed IoT connectivity. As we are a very specialized division of just providing IoT services to large enterprises, we provide really tailor-made solution. We are well known in the market for a very quality, high-end service, and we have really unique competence. Next slide, please. So we're really proud of our global IoT coverage, and we have, as I said, like a specialized IoT organization. Today, we're covering more than 500 networks in 200 countries, again, mainly via permanent roaming. We have like a global organization. We are like covering the Nordics, and then we have also presence in South Africa, Australia, Germany, and all those other countries that we're seeing here. This is basically to be able to serve our customers in these countries as well with a local support. And then as IoT is really an international market, we are really providing services to those large enterprises around the globe. I mean, Volvo, Husqvarna, Scania, and SAIC, and so on. So we started in Sweden, and we have expanded around the world. Next slide, please. And then just to conclude, Telenor IoT, it's part of the Telenor Group. We are fully owned company by the Telenor Group. And Telenor Group is a large operator group with more than 200 million subscribers. Quite, of course, having a heritage in the Nordics where we have operators, but also with presence in Asia. And Telenor Group is actually a quite old company with more than 160 years of history. Okay, thank you so much. I think now I leave the floor to you, Donald.
Thank you, Luciana, and thank you, Colin International, for having us here. And I look forward to what I'll call the conversation we're going to have later. But I want to take a moment, Sarah, if I can, to introduce a bit about Transitel and who we are, to set some context for this the discussion that will follow. So, Sarah, if we can have our slides. So if we can go to the third slide. Next. Okay. So Transitel is a leading provider of global cellular connectivity services. We're licensed to operate in many countries around the world where we provide our services. We provide our services using ITU-issued global numbering resources. So that's the MCC MNC 901, in our case, 37, and telephone numbers starting with the +882 range that are also assigned by the ITU. We have a direct agreements with mobile carriers across 200 countries and territories with a fully owned and globally distributed core network. We are able to connect to both private 5G networks, public and satellites, public mobile services, satellite, and cellular access. We have an award-winning multi-operator service through embedded SIM software and in-house assets for unrivaled performance, capabilities, and reliability. It's a, IoT M2M connectivity is a specialized service that does require things perhaps that are different than your standard consumer products. If we can go to the next slide. Sarah? There are three main segments that we address. We address connected industries, we address connected vehicles, and we address connected devices. And amongst those segments, you can add that some of them are mobile and some of them are stationary, each of them having its own unique challenges and opportunities, I would say. So if I looked at connected industries, for instance, we have connected SIM, we have provided this IoT M2M for Airbus. So every time an Airbus lands somewhere in the world, the telematics are sent back to analyze what needs to happen with the plane, allowing therefore faster and efficient services in terms of repair, maintenance, etc. Obviously, this is a service that is mobile, if not constantly mobile. In connected vehicles, we provide a suite of services of connected vehicles that include telematics, internet on board, Wi-Fi on board, infotainment, which is to a limited set of services like Spotify or Google Maps, emergency calling, where that's required by law in the various countries that we operate in, and also which is a voice stroke SMS service. And then finally, we also have what I'll call concierge services, which are really about private services between the automobile manufacturer and its customers, so that you can call them, for instance, if your car breaks down on the road, they have roadside assistance, or if you want to make an appointment to get your car maintained. And then you have connected devices, which are, eSIMs inside of laptops, etc., that are used when someone is no longer accessing Wi-Fi or when they want to ensure that their Wi-Fi is secure by not using hotspots. And that's just a little bit about us and some of our customers that we serve. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Veronica, you're muted.
Yes. Yes. Is it better now? Thank you. Thank you, Luciana. Thank you, Donald. Thank you for your introduction to Telenor Connection and to Transatel. And without further ado, I would like to move to our discussion and address some of the key challenges facing the global IoT connectivity providers in the European context. And I will start with the very first issues I already brought during my short intro. It has to do with the general authorization regime, with the implementation of general authorization regime for global IoT connectivity providers, such as yourself. So my question would be, could anything be done to improve the red to cut the red tape, to remove the complexity of the authorization requirements across the 27 EU member states plus other countries in Europe, such as the UK or EEA countries? Because as I hope you've seen from my introductory presentation, in reality, providers such as Transatel and Telenor, where they're really confronted with very, very divergent requirements, despite the common regulatory framework that we have in the code. Who wants to speak first? Donald? Sorry, Robert. Would you like to comment first?
Yeah. I can say a few things. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Maurik. I'm not only the regulator in Ireland, but for my sins, I'm also the chair of BEREC this year. And in the past, I worked for one of those companies that Luciana and Donald represent now. And one of my jobs was actually to put together a European pan-European IoT network and go around all the member states in Europe, and actually further than that, we did it on a global scale to get the licenses and the general authorizations in every country. I have to make a distinction here between getting a general authorization and some of the requirements that are attached to the authorization. So if I want to answer your question, Veronica, getting the general authorization is relatively standardized, at least in Europe, and it isn't a big deal. It's usually with the exception of a few countries, but it usually boils down to filling out one piece of paper. The challenge sometimes is the language, but also that is not too big a deal. And then you are registered. That's not the problem. The problem is what requirements are attached to that general authorization. And that can differ quite a bit from country to country. And although in Europe, you can only attach certain types of requirements to a general authorization, it still allows for about 1,000 permutations in Europe, which is for any company very difficult to deal with that. I would say that there definitely is scope to improve and to take away the red tape. And at the moment, BEREC is working with the European Commission to make how shall I say, to analyze what requirements are attached to general authorizations across Europe. And what we are half thinking about is trying to standardize those, to not do away with them, but to make the number of permutations small, so that we know that if you are a IoT company in Sweden, you have to provide similar information to the regulator as when you are an IoT provider in Spain. In other words, you can better foresee what you have to do. So there is definitely scope, and I think there is, in fact, we're working on that very topic. Hopefully, something that we can introduce in the new Digital Network Act.
Can I just look, if I can have a moment to respond to that? And I think, first of all, I think all providers of connectivity service for IoT and M2M and connected cars would be delighted to see the simplification of the requirements post getting the general authorization in the EU. So we look forward to seeing how that's going to pan out, and are fully supportive of that move by BEREC and the European Commission. And while I would like to say that the general authorization regime that was introduced in 2002 is working properly, I don't frankly think it is. And I mean that because there are only 2 member states that basically don't require notification, and I don't have an issue with notifying. Notifying is simple, and allegedly, but it's not when you go to certain member states. In Ireland, which is Comreg, has a very simple notification process. I go online, I put my services in, a few hours later I get a response back saying all is hunky-dory, and it goes automatically into the registered system, which is fantastic. Other member states aren't as easy. They require things that go beyond Article 2.4 of the EECC, which has a very limited amount of information that's fully harmonized that can, in fact, be required. So it's, your company name, your legal address, your contact details, the services that you're providing, the network you're providing, where in the member state you're going to provide the services, and when you're going to start providing the services. But we have a whole slew of things that have been thrown on by other member states. We have your VAT, your company registration number. Depending on my services, I may not need a VAT number by law, under European law. We have some countries that are still insisting on proof of legal establishment in the member state. This has already been declared by the ECJ to be contrary to the treaty. Why is it still there? We have, issues around criminal records of both the company and the directors. Why is this still here? We have translation apostille of corporate documents. Again, not within the scope of the meeting. Local addresses for notice of services, which in other contexts in the tax contents have also been declared to be unnecessary and contrary to the ECJ. And I think I don't necessarily want to say that the European concept of the one-stop shop license is required, but we do need to get a point where it's one license application across all member states and not exceeding the scope of what is currently in the ECJ or in the European Electronic Communications Code or whatever comes next.
I would like to
Well,
comment as well.
uh,
Yes, if possible, because
yes,
I'm
maybe just a quick remark to make sure I understood Donald's suggestion correctly. So, Donald, you're suggesting to go slightly beyond individual member state notification and considering like one stop shop?
No, I don't think it's necessary. If the general authorization regime
Okay,
does what it's
okay,
supposed to do, then notification is not a barrier to entry. The current 27 versions of it and some add-ons, I would say, creates the barrier.
yeah.
thank you.
Yes, and I would like to second you, Donald, because this is what we are seeing as well. So we also believe that harmonization on the actual notification process would be really good. If not, if this cannot be achieved, then we believe that it would be good to have a one unified like a regime for notification, you know, or really the one-stop shop. I think that would also be a way to solve it. But we have and we are facing the same issues that in practice there is much more being asked when we are notifying our services. And to be frank, in one member state, when we are also notifying the services, we are also asking how the services are going to be provided. And we also have been told that permanent roaming is not allowed, for instance. So of course, this was just a confusion within the person we were talking with, but I think it creates a lot of work and also like insecurity in the process.
What is very interesting from my point of view is that you are basically at the vanguard of delivering a single solution across all countries. For most telecom services, they are based there for consumers. They're based in one country, and that gives a completely different dynamic than having to provide a single network with a single service across all those jurisdictions. So I find it very interesting and hopefully a harbinger of the future, how we can have and how we can develop uh, a single service layer that works seamlessly across all European countries in that sense. If you start to talk, and you mentioned it a few times, that there are a lot of international uh, countries here from outside of Europe, the problems just multiply as soon as you start to talk about certain countries in the Middle East or in Asia or wherever. Then you get lots more variations. I've had to deal with that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, if what we just discussed reminded me some comments made by participants from the European Commission during our previous webinar, where essentially they commented on the Commission is now listening. They certainly take this opportunity to see what could be changed. And on one hand, they would like to see what could be harmonized, and on the other hand, they want to see what could be simplified. So between those two approaches, like say one-stop shop, one pan-European notification, or maximum harmonization of national notification requirements, national authorization requirements, there certainly could be, you know, different arguments, different pros and cons, which needs to be carefully weighed. Because Robert, I think you mentioned very well what are the potential risks associated if you finally go to that ultimately single notification regime just in one member state, that there could be implications, for example, on end user protection side. I think you mentioned that, right?
Um, yeah, I think there are differences between how to register and what to do, but also then who is in the end responsible for protecting the consumer. And I think what we what we see in Europe is that things are, because there's not a single regulator, if you rely on the let's say on the regulator of one member state to help you in upholding consumer rights in another member state, that's just a bridge too far. So I think overseeing consumer rights tends to be something for the local regulator, whereas licenses and those sorts of things that could be could potentially be something that you could passport in from another member state over the long duration. But there's still so many problems to solve. One of the biggest headaches that I had, and I don't know whether Luciana or Donald had the same, is just a simple registration of SIMs. If you have um, a car, for example, that is owned by a certain person, that you had to register the SIM in that country. And how do you do that if you don't have, as an IoT provider, you don't have shops and you don't have all that infrastructure? That can be really, really complex. So I feel for them. Yeah.
Can I respond to that, because I think it's an interesting one, and I think it's something that we all face. And some national member states have taken out SIM registration for M2M IoT devices. So Belgium comes to mind with that. And I think the question is, what is fit for purpose for a IoT M2M registration? Do you need to know, and I'll just make one up, in the case of a connected refrigerator that only sends data or only collects data, who owns that device? Probably not. When you deal with connected cars, the SIM registration was brought about to increase national security, to increase understanding who the customer was. And if you look at connected cars, I would argue that there are better ways to register, to do SIM registration, and that is through the VIN number, which is a uniform number available in each member state that gives you clear information as to who the owner is at any given time, even if the car is sold. Allows the police, if they're trying to undertake an investigation, to know that they're dealing with, a X model car of X color, because that information is also provided. And that actually increases what I'll call the national security element of SIM registration, and also reduces the burden on the car manufacturers or the IoT connectivity providers in terms of SIM registration. And it's much more fit for purpose. And I think those things have to be looked at in terms of European industrial policy. Connected cars represent, car manufacturing in Europe represents 7% of GDP, of European GDP. And we have to facilitate their ability to do this, especially when their competitors aren't required to do the same thing in other countries.
Luciana, would you like to comment on that?
No, I think I agree with you, Donald. So I have no further comments on that one. So I agree.
Yeah.
To me,
You
it
know
demonstrates.
something, just
To me, it demonstrates,
I
Veronica, suddenly that you see that legislation was designed for retail services and with retail services in mind, and that in many cases, regulators are trying to uphold legislation for retail services that are not quite suited to IoT services and devices. And that's kind of the problem that we have, and a lot of times you have to almost explain what the objective of some of those services is.
Thank you, Robert. You actually brought me to the very remark I wanted to make. Basically, if we are talking about IoT, not all IoT services are alike, because there are different categories. There are different types of IoT services depending on to what extent there is some human interaction involved, to what extent there are any end user charges, end user fees, if any, to what extent there are actually other aspects affecting and potentially other consumer protection aspects. And accordingly, depending on that dimension, there could be also different data retention or registration requirements depending on the nature of IoT services. So maybe there is a scope to look at the different categories of IoT services and see what could make sense indeed to maybe further harmonize and simplify, and other aspects that maybe should be looked a bit deeper into. I think it was also the aspect that Barrick brought up already back in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, when for the first time published its surveys questionnaire of various IoT indicators, where it suggested that maybe we need to look into more narrowly defined IoT categories and see what's applicable and what makes sense for specific types of IoT services. What do you think? Would it make sense, or would it make things even more complicated?
It depends on how it would be implemented, right? I think the idea is it's very good, but then you have all the member states. As long as you can harmonize and everyone is implementing in the same way, then it is a very good idea. Otherwise, you could create again like a variety of different types of interpretation of what it is and M2M services, or what it is, a service behind. Maybe there is also room to look into outside Europe if any other regulators have solved the problem or look into the problem in a different way. I think Singapore applies different types of like licensing and notification depending on what kind of service is being provided. So I think they have tried like a quite pragmatic approach, and I think it could be a good idea to see as well if you can get inspiration from other nations.
Thank you, Luciana.
Yeah, in my experience, the only thing that we have defined in Europe is M2M, which is a subsection of IoT. And we have not yet defined IoT, but at the same time, I think you could investigate that further, but we haven't seen much evidence of real issues or a real request for regulating or making clearer what those other categories are. In the end, the way the industry seems to work is that if you want to provide a service in a particular country, you contact operators there and you do a commercial agreement, and that's kind of at the backbone of these services. And as long as there is transparency between the IoT provider or the company that does the orchestration and the local network partner, you can contractually solve anything. And that, as Barrick, we have noticed that we didn't see a real ask or a real need to go too much further, but we are keeping our mind open on all of these things. M2M is clear, that has been defined, but then other services are those that stray more into the area of, for example, in the connected car, you have services that open the door or that switch on the seats or warm up the car beforehand through your app in your phone. Or if you go further, you have services to have a Wi-Fi hotspot in the car, for example. Where does M2M stop and where does IoT start? We haven't got a clear view on that, nor have we had very big demands so far to regulate any further.
Thank you.
Can I
Thank
take
you.
that on?
Yes. Yes.
Look, I think it's clear. IoT is not defined. Connected cars aren't defined, but M2M is. And what you're seeing happening in Europe, I believe now, is that not everyone, but certain operators that are active in the space, MNOs, I won't name them and shame them, are in fact making it, using those lack of definitional resources to basically say, no, you can't do this because it's IoT, and that's not covered by the roaming regulation that only has M2M, or this is interpersonal communications or internet access, which is covered, and it's all, quite frankly, a big mess. And while, so I think part of it is really IoT and M2M and connected car services are global services. And by that, I mean that the customers need to be able to turn on their device wherever in the world that device ends up. a car manufacturer manufactures a car in their plant in Sweden or France or Germany, and that car can end up anywhere in Europe, but beyond that, anywhere in the world. And the simplicity of at least creating for the European industry and the European single market a clear definition of what's in scope and what's out of scope means that they can compete against their global peers, whether that be Chinese or American or Japanese. And part of that is ensuring that for IoT M2M services, we have to recognize they're different than, as you said earlier, Robert, the consumer services. And what you need is access, permanent roaming access across the EU. And there's many ways to achieve that, but one of them is ensuring that anyone that's providing IoT and connected car services isn't blocked by MVNOs across Europe.
So Donald, are you suggesting that there is a scope to revisit provisions on wholesale agreements under permanent roaming regulations, or perhaps outside of roaming regulation, but basically looking into the terms and conditions for wholesale permanent roaming agreements and perhaps considering some regulatory intervention? Is that what you're suggesting, or perhaps at least some fallback mechanisms if negotiations fail, if commercial negotiations fail?
Yeah, I think there has to be a fallback mechanism if commercial negotiations fail. And I don't think, and one of the biggest problems is that permanent roaming falls outside the scope of the roaming regulation. And quite frankly, if you're using a 901XX issued by the ITU, or you're even using a local number because you're using an Italian MCC, MNC, and Italian numbering range, you're involved in permanent roaming. You have to get access to permanent roaming if you want to grow this business and ensure that we create a European digital single market that can compete globally, because it is a global provision of services. It is a global business. So it's finding that right balance, and I'm sure this debate will happen as we look at all the reviews that poor Robert has inherited this year as the president of BEREC, or the chairman of BEREC.
Luciana, what's your view on that? Permanent roaming and possible regulatory intervention on permanent roaming for machine to machine for IoT.
I think above all, it is also important to clarify, because I do feel there is a confusion in the market when you are discussing. Some confuse, the roaming regulation and interpret as like permanent roaming not being allowed even for M2M. That is our experience sometimes. So I think there is a need for clarity, and then perhaps some sort of fallback mechanism could work. We also see that it is really necessary to promote permanent roaming, especially for Europe. That is really the way to address, I think, the market and to create a really pan-European market. I mean, even if we have the new technologies coming in, SGP32 eSIM with ability to switch, still it will not replace roaming and permanent roaming. So more clarity, I think it is needed, and even more certainty actually to the MVNOs as well.
My next question would be probably very, very closely linked to what we just discussed on commercial negotiations. And maybe, Donald, you would be best positioned to answer that question first. What happens if commercial negotiations on permanent roaming fail these days? Where would you bring it? To whom would you complain, if any? Is there any resort?
Look, I think the problem is that I guess I would have to go back to competition law, because there is no other resort. While if I'm dealing with what I'll call consumer roaming, there is a backup, which is there is a maximum price established by the framework. Mm-hmm. That means that I can figure out if that works with my business case or not, and move forward on that basis. And and there has been the study that was done for the Commission has actually a rate for IoT roaming, M2M roaming, set up for data services that is distinct and different from the same rate for consumer services. But at the end of the day, there is no single company in Europe, whether they're an MNO or an MVNO, that can provide a comprehensive suite of services using their own network, covering every member state. they are all, everyone is negotiating permanent roaming for IoT. And a large company probably has more leverage in its ability to secure permanent roaming than an MVNO that doesn't have the ability to trade on roaming. So, and the fact is that a lot of the industry that relies on this are choosing specialized providers, not only ourselves, to do their IoT and M2M, because we deliver something beyond what I'll call the traditional suite of packages that you get as a consumer.
But yeah, so we believe as well that it is a large amount of commercial negotiations around permanent roaming. And in our view, it is actually working fine as long as, of course, you have the volumes. And what we can see is that at least specialized MVNOs are able to really amass a mass amount of volumes that they're able to, of course, negotiate. But of course, this is something that requires a close follow-up to make sure that the market is really working, because at the end, I think it is beneficial for everyone in this industry that permanent roaming is working, and it becomes really a de facto without any kind of uncertainty for really the rollout of pan-European services.
Sarah just reminded me that we also should allow our audience to address their questions. And so, Sarah, could you please look if we have any questions from the audience at this stage?
Yeah, we have some question. However, we only have a few minutes left, so we will try to take as many questions as possible. No worries. So we have here a question. So are you expecting more regulatory confusion with the Cyber Resilience Act, so CRA, coming soon for the IoT world? Do you think there will also be an impact with the CRA? I don't know who wants to take this question. Okay. No one?
What to expect?
Yeah.
I think if I can give you I don't have a very specific answer, but two things. First of all, network security is going to be increasingly important, and insecure networks are not going to be acceptable in future, especially not in this geopolitical phase of our history. And secondly, we when you're trying to put together a pan-European network or even a global network, the biggest problem that you bump into, in my view, are the different security requirements that each member state has with regard to data harboring, with regard to whether you have to break out your voice locally or not. All those things are the biggest headache, and I actually hope for industry that these things get resolved a bit more with future regulation rather than get worse, because in my view it can't get much worse.
Okay,
Luciana,
maybe.
Donald, maybe the next one.
Yeah, okay, because I have so one question, well, two questions here from the same participant from Canada, if I'm not wrong. So the first one is for Luciana. So this participant is currently dealing with a remote access SIM registration, cross-border data transfer, and is asking how are you managing IoT services in China, if you have a license or working with a local partner.
We work with a local partner. In China, permanent roaming it's for us not allowed. That is how we interpret it. Not allowed. Sometimes there are different understanding, but we interpret as not allowed. So we work with a local partner in China. Definitely.
And then yeah.
If I may join Luciana's remark, it was also the conclusion of our IoT research team. That's ultimately the only way to have business in China for
Yes,
the
because
time being.
the other problem with China was that not only is you can't even use an eSIM that is produced anywhere
Exactly.
else but China. So you kind of have to make a special SKU for whatever product you have.
Thank you. And then another question from the same participant, but this time for Robert. So the participant is asking if Roam like at home is applicable for IoT roaming if the commercial negotiations fail.
No, Roam like at home is something that is for uh, travel use for end users. It is not there for IoT or for end-to-end products, so you can't fall back to that. Unfortunately, the limitation on permanent roaming does apply, but Roam like at home does not apply.
Thank you.
Exactly, exactly. Those are the two dimensions, whether or not roaming regulation applies to permanent roaming or not. It applies as long as fair use limits and other aspects are concerned. Ultimately, any national operator can block you or to deny negotiations of permanent roaming, arguing that it could be treated as an abusive use of roaming. But as long as the consumer protection measures are concerned, Roam like at home is intended as a fallback mechanism to protect consumers, to protect European consumers occasionally traveling from one country to the other, and not to protect M2M providers or IoT providers. That's what we have.
Again, one last question, because after that we need to close the webinar. So if there is such a demand for seamless permanent roaming across EU, why aren't there MVNOs going after this niche?
Well, um, so as an MVNO, we are going after the niche, is what I would say. So, and let's be clear, even what I'll call full-fledged mobile operators, MNOs, are going after this niche because a lot of them have IoT divisions. Telenor's here, they have an operator in the Nordics, but they still need permanent roaming if they want to provide their services in countries where they don't have an operation. So
Exactly.
everyone's going after this niche. Some of us are MNOs plus MVNOs in certain markets, but all of us are MVNOs in the markets that we don't have spectral resources in.
Yeah.
We
And
really
and
need each
again, if
other.
I could,
No one is able
yes.
to cover the entire Europe without roaming, basically.
On a permanent basis.
And Luciana,
Yes.
Donald, you illustrated it very well when you mentioned your key customers. They all have global needs. They all have global supplies. So clearly, in order to be, they just need to rely on a cross-border connectivity, and they don't want to negotiate access agreements with 100 MNOs across all countries they operate. So it's a natural demand driven aspect, I would say, no.
Look, and if you look at, I'll just add, if you also look at certain industries like the connected car industry, those manufacturers of cars are requesting, it's part of what their wish list is to have access to two networks in each country that they operate. So even an MNO providing services in Germany is going to have to negotiate some form of roaming arrangement with one of their counterparts in order to meet the customer demand, the customer need for that IoT, that particular IoT and M2M service. And I'm sure there'll be others coming up that way, but that's the one where it's needed. Why? Because they look at, the coverage. They need ubiquitous coverage around the country, around a member state. They need to have been able to provide e-call services by law wherever that car may be. So they do need the ability to use two networks and are in fact requesting that as part of their requirements.
Thank you. Well, I think we have exceeded the time allocated to this webinar. I
Well,
guess
just by
the
5 minutes.
discussion could go on and on, but at some point we need to stop somewhere. Luciana, Donald, Robert, and Veronica, thank you for being there with us today. Thank you to all the participants who stayed connected during the webinar. So as a reminder, you will get the link to the recording tomorrow by email. and so you will be able to rewatch it if you need to, or send it to your colleagues. And yeah, don't forget the feedback after this webinar. So as soon as we finish, it will pop up on your screen. So remember that it's good for the planet, because we will plant a tree for each feedback we receive. And stay tuned for our next webinar on IoT that will have more global reach. We will check what's happening outside of the EU, and I think it promises to be quite interesting. But more information will come soon. Stay tuned. Voila. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Luciana, Donald, Robert. Thank you so much for sharing your views. And I look forward to continuing our discussion as the review of regulatory framework goes on.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye.